The gate was never anyone's idea of a home. It clung to the farthest edge of the system like a barnacle welded to night, 1,000 meters of armored corridors and sensor spires, a bristling rib cage at the point where sunlight thinned to theory. We called it Watchtower because the official name wasn't a comfort, and because the myth of a wall is easier to live with than the truth of an orbit. My post was simple and unending. Watch, endure, report. Senior watch officer, last link on a chain that ran from the warm noise of Earth to this cold hinge where the maps gave up and the void began. Duty out here wasn't a thing you chose each morning. It was the air. You breathed it until you forgot there had ever been another way to live. The station breathed with you, metal lungs drawing in power, pressure, recycled moisture, exhaling heat into the dark. On the hull, you could feel its pulse through the boots, a deep, restless shudder that never quite settled, like an animal trying not to wake. I checked the seal at my neck by habit, glove tracing the ring until my thumb found the notch. The indicator band was steady blue. Nothing leaked but time. That was the first lesson. The second was that the universe didn't push from behind like the old speeches promised. It pulled from ahead, thin, patient, waiting for your hand to slip. My tether ticked soft along the guide as I worked. Node 7 sat on a rake of struts where the station's spine met the forward sensor array, a fin of instruments knifing the dark. I powered the calibration probe and swept its head in patient arcs across the sensor stack. On my HUD, decimals marched in green and amber, drifting within comfort and then returning as if ashamed to have wandered. Predictable variance, the closest thing to mercy. When the probe's casing flashed a tiny dull line under my suit light, I knew it without looking. My scratch. Last month, I'd overcorrected during a meteor drill. Landry had said I'd signed the tools, then made a ceremony of pretending to log me for damage. A joke for two men with nothing else to sign. Out here, the smallest imperfection grew into a relic. Ritual is how you keep your hands steady when the quiet stretches too long. The calm crackled in my ear with the particular sandpaper of local bandwidth and not enough sleep. Hail, you still alive out there or communing with the ancestors? Node 7, final sweep, I said. Form kept the edges sharp. Formality isn't for show out here. It's how you remember where the floor is. Copy, Landry said after the hiss of the thermal regulators cut across the line. Bring it in when you're done. Mess ran out of charm half an hour ago, but I saved you something that pretends to be chocolate. Trade you a red ration for whatever's in that cipher case. He never expected change. It was how he paid himself for staying. My glove found the small weight on my belt anyway, the Hail cipher, black and smooth from generations of worried hands. The crest etched on its face had been polished almost flat by men who did not live long enough to raise their sons. Not for trade, I said, and kept my voice steady. The last thing my father touched before the Odyssey went silent. You don't barter with the dead. I finished the sweep, thumbed the probe to sleep, and signaled retrieval. The umbilical took my weight and slid me back across the hull, the station's curvature turning beneath me until the airlock swallowed the stars. Inside, polymer sealant and machine grease cut sharp through the filters. I glanced, habit, superstition, out past the viewport as the outer door cycled. The sky out here never gave you true dark, just a bruised color that wasn't a color at all. The exclusion grid overlaid my visor with a net of lines only we could see, a fence drawn by distant admirals who had learned how to be afraid. Decons stung the suit with a million fine needles. I stood and counted heartbeats until the hatch light turned green. When I broke seal, the station's air rushed in, all ozone and the distant ghost of burnt plastic that no one could ever quite pin down. Landry was waiting with his arms crossed and his posture all angles and old pain. "You missed mess," he said, flicking something at me. I caught a wrapper with the reckless reflex of a man who had once dodged a floating wrench and felt brave about it. Chocolate. The real kind, contraband with a smuggler's guilt baked into every square. Command pinged twice about your whole time. Brass gets twitchy when the old ghosts wander near the fence. Protocol, I said. Node readings drifted a tenth. Recalibrated. We both let the lie stand. I lingered because the hull was the last place where the noise in my head could sort itself into straight lines. Out there, with the universe tugging at me and nothing to hear but my breath and the suit's slow chorus, I could almost believe I belonged to the story that had been written before I was born. "Keep saying it like that and they'll promote you to a poster," Landry said. He was broad across the shoulders where the Martian grav had tried to make a long man short. His voice had worn down to a drawl that made you think of red dust and corroded handrails. His jokes traded in what we didn't say. The station taught you to talk around fear. You name it and the thing got inside your suit. I stripped the helmet and felt the familiar weight of the station settle behind my eyes. The corridor rattled with the footsteps of a rotating shift. Somewhere, a maintenance crew cursed a stuck panel. We were a population of 97 bodies and 300 myths, most of them older than the paint on the bulkheads. Routine wrapped us all like a blanket you didn't wash often enough. In my quarters, a schematic of the Odyssey took up half a wall. A printout faded into sepia by bad air and time. I could have traced the corridor's blind, crew decks, engine spine, the bridge where Walton Hale recorded his last orders. I didn't remember my father's face as much as I remembered the shape his absence left in a room. His voice lived in the way my hand settled when I held the cipher, in the places I stood to stare for too long, in the way I listened for something that would never speak again. On the watch floor, we ran drills like prayers. The young techs arriving from the belt learned the rhythms quickly or they didn't last. Cameras panned, pings answered. The perimeter whispered to itself in the language of distance and velocity. Most of the time, you watched a whole lot of nothing move with conviction. On the bad days, the nothing wanted something from you. The alarm that chirped was the soft one, half apology and half waking touch. We both looked because that's what your body does before your mind gets a vote. The main display picked up the ghost, tagged it, tried to be helpful. Sensor anomaly, Landry read. Class, echo. Echoes were the station's word for grief that showed up on a scope. We logged them, we blessed them with procedure. We went back to waiting. This one shifted. Tiny at first, a correction more than emotion. Then another and another as if it remembered momentum. I moved before I thought, hands sliding the view into focus, isolating the block of data where mass, vector, and spectrum argued with each other about what they were. The digits stabilized in a way rocks don't. Too regular for a shard, too large for a drone. The classifier spun its old roulette and spit out a possibility it should not have known how to say. Exodus class, Landry said softly, and then stopped because there are some words you don't say twice. My mouth tasted of iron. The station's lights seemed too bright and too far away. The designation blinked, not confirmed, not yet, but the machine's confidence climbed with every tick. I kept my voice and let it hold me up. Ops to Earth, I said into the tangle. Watch Officer Hale. Confirm anomaly sector Delta 9. Vector inbound on standard. Request guidance. The line back to Earth could be instantaneous when it wanted to be. It took its time now because the people at the other end were turning around in their chairs to ask someone else if this was a joke, if a dead ship could knock on a door. We listened to the station breathe. We watched numbers behave like they'd been practicing. Landry's armor hung from his hand, helmet caught on a finger. He didn't put it on. He didn't look away from the board. "Adrienne," he said, and for once he didn't make it a joke or a warning. I zoomed the visual feed until the dust of the outer dark became a smear, until a shape started to gather itself out of nothing, too far and too dirty to name, but with lines that belonged to the diagrams on my wall more than to anything that had launched this century. The classifier stopped pretending to doubt itself. The amber letters came up and held. Odyssey. I let out a breath that felt like something being cut free. 50 years is long enough to turn truth into a bedtime story and weld caution into law. The Odyssey had been the flagship of the lost generation and the grave of our name. The Aegis Corps taught its lesson in every academy on 3 worlds. The line holds because we don't step beyond it. We had posted ourselves at the gate to keep that promise neat. The tangle chimed. Earth's voice arrived in a tone designed to fit on a transcript. Copy hail. Maintain observation. Initiate lockdown per exclusion protocol. No engagement until further instruction. Lockdown. The words slid through the room with a practiced ease. Pressure doors templated. Systems that had yawned open all day snapped shut in strings of coded clicks that spelled out reassurance in a dozen languages. The station's cameras swiveled to new angles without complaint. The ops board flushed red where it loved to be dramatic. Landry didn't wait for me to say it. He was already opening a channel to his team, pulling soldiers out of mess and maintenance like a magician pulling scarves out of a sleeve. People moved with the gate you only learn in places where the walls can decide whether you live. No one ran. Running is what gets you killed. I kept my eyes on the numbers because numbers don't flinch. The anomaly corrected course with small, confident nudges, as if compensating for the nudge and drag of dust. The exclusion boundary was a theory drawn on glass, and the thing beyond it tracked along an old memory lane. Vector constant, I said. No IFFF handshake. Everything in system carried an identification friend or foe marker, even the freighters too proud of their rust. It was the way the universe told you it had the good sense to announce itself. This contact said nothing. Silence is a language too. The board logged the distance in digits that mattered more to my chest than to the corridor. The young tech near the viewport forgot to pretend he wasn't new and wiped his palms on his uniform. I kept my hands on the console so I would not take the cipher out and let it tell me stories. Walton's last transmission lived in my head like a splinter. Hold the line. He had said it to men who were already gone. He had said it to the myth that would replace them. He had said it to me, though he couldn't have known my name. The station hummed around us, content that a plan existed. Landry stood at my shoulder with his armor half-clasped and his mouth pressed into a line that meant he was counting how many doors he could shut and still get back out again. In the corner of my display, Earth's heartbeat verified receipt of our status pings and sent nothing useful back. Protocol Delta, Landry said into his mic, voice shaping the air into obedience. Runners on standby. Gun decks hot. Hold internal. No one isolates. On my mark. I nodded without looking at him. The thing in the dark did not hesitate. It adjusted for us as if it had known our positions before we declared them. The gate did what gates do. It braced. It arranged itself into the idea of a fortress, and hoped no one would notice how thin a line really is when you step back far enough to see the rest of the night. My palm rested flat on the console, the cipher's weight pressed against my belt. The schematic on my wall looked suddenly like a map home. Maintain observation, Earth had said, calm as a signed receipt. We did. I watched the designation burn steady on the glass and told myself the old lesson still held. The line endures because someone says it does and stays to take the next breath. Out beyond the grid, the Odyssey kept coming. Lockdown moved through the gate like a practiced breath, doors sealing in ripples, cameras pivoting to their assigned arcs, status lights dropping from complacent amber to the deeper, steadier red that meant someone else would be deciding how long we blinked. Earth's voice had arrived with transcript polish and a bureaucrat's faith in distance. Maintain observation. Initiate exclusion protocol. Await further directives. We obeyed because obedience is what keeps a station from breaking itself in half when the unknown starts making decisions for you. The unknown crossed the line like it had never believed in lines. It didn't drift. It corrected. Tiny pulses against dust drag and perturbation, a sailor trimming for currents only it could feel. As the gate rolled on its axis to present the hard points, the thing slid along our approach corridor as if the path had been scored into space 50 years ago and was only now being traced again. On the forward feed, the hull came out of grain and glare, not wreckage, not new, an old silhouette armored in something the charts didn't have a word for. It caught the station lights and returned them wrong, a color that landed in the eye like a taste. "Your ghost knows the way," Landry said. He had his armor half on and a stillness about him that wasn't calm. The squad on his channel answered in clipped acknowledgments, the music of men who were letting routine eat their fear. "Vector steady," I said. "No IFF." Saying it made the silence feel like an act instead of a default. The docking logic woke itself. A string of handshakes scrolled across my screen, each protocol opening like a flower, accepting and passing a signature forward to the next layer. I entered the manual override twice. The system ignored me twice with a politeness that read like possession. "Automated capture in 5, the computer said in the voice we never thought about, because we had never needed to hate it. 4, 3. "Belay," I said. "Manual hold." The hold registered. Then it cleared itself. The clamps extended, teeth glinting under the station floods. On the feed, the foreign growth along the other hull flowed, just enough to be a verb, toward the metal. It wasn't a rush. Nothing out here rushed. It was gravity imitating appetite. Contact sounded wrong. No reassuring thunk, no mechanical punctuation to make a story out of proximity. Pressure rolled through the deck and settled behind my eyes. Somewhere deep in the structure, a resonance started to hum. Low, patient, too regular to be error, and too intimate to be threat. The ops board flagged it as a minor resonance anomaly, non-critical. My skull disagreed. "Environmental?" I asked. "Stable," said the young tech who still over-enunciated when he was scared. "Seal integrity nominal. No particulate breach. Readings. Shifting. But within..." "Within what?" Landry asked without looking away from the hatch feed. "Within where they always shift," the kid said, and I let him keep the lie. A message threaded itself through the comm, a preface chime no one had programmed, the specific tone humans use when they want something from other humans. The text appeared on the operations glass and on the terminals in the corridors and in the tiny window above my rack and on the back wall of Decon Module 3 like it had always belonged there. Docking sequence complete. "Welcome, Watch Officer Hale." Landry's gloved knuckle rapped once against my console, a small sound to anchor a room. "That the greeting you were expecting? Not protocol," I said. "Not random either," he said, and keyed his squad. "Positions. No one opens, no one wanders. Fire only if fired upon. Runners, eyes high." The hatch indicator flowers bloomed orange, one by one. The station asserted its authority over pressure and made a little show of it because that's how systems reassure their builders. The manual control remained under my hand, a comfort without a function. I tried the interdict again. The panel accepted the command, logged it, and dutifully announced that my interdict had been superseded by a senior authorization. We did not have a senior authorization aboard. We had a ship. Adrienne, Landry said. He didn't have to say anything else. He was asking whether the next thing I did would be cowardice or audacity, and whether I knew the difference this time of night. Hold the corridor, I said. No one crosses the paint. He nodded as if I'd given him a better answer. The interior hatch cycled. A smell rode in on the pressure change. Not rot, not the metallic tang of an unfriendly atmosphere, something more like the aftermath of a sterile place burning. Antiseptic and sweet and wrong. Filaments like spun sugar drew themselves from dock to dock, webbing the seam. They clung and then rooted, fine threads thickening to veins. The sensors loved them. They were a problem with numbers. The first figure stepped in from the ship like an idea testing the room. For a heartbeat, it could have been human in the old suit cut, helmet fogged, shoulder lights dead, movement almost familiar. The cadence was wrong. Every motion landed a fraction off, like a puppeteer who had learned the steps out of sequence. Resin trailed off its boots and drew little glistening commas across our deck. The thing's right arm, fused at the elbow into the suit by layers of translucent matter, rose in a palm-outward gesture that read as greeting if you were generous and warning if you weren't. Identify, Landry said, the full ritual in his tone, nothing to invite conversation beyond the narrow path he wanted. The helmet turned, corridor light refracted in the visor in patterns that crawled over the ceiling and made the young tech mutter a prayer he thought no one could hear. The suit's external speaker cracked open in a fizz of static and low tone. The sound poured through the floor and found my jaw. Not language, not yet. Something like a choir wrecking itself against a delay loop. Behind it, more shapes gathered. They moved too quickly when startled and then stopped in the same breath, the herd logic of hunting machines grafted onto bodies that remembered convention only in outline. Runners, the old fleet logs had nicknamed anything that rearranged your sense of distance by moving wrong. The name sat in my head with the taste of old metal. Hold, I said, and heard my voice come back in my father's register. The line kept us from firing by accident. The line sold us the lie that intention would prevail over panic. The resin on the walls sprouted hand shapes, or the memory of hands and the sloughed suggestion of teeth. Surfaces took impressions the way soft clay does when pressed, then froze them halfway through the act of remembrance. Vessel scars, a technical manual had once called them. Ship as reliquary, ship as graveyard, ship as skin. Environmental, tighten seals, I said. Filter indices up 2 points. Keep it contained even if it's theater. Yes, sir, the kid said, getting his mouth around sir like it was a ladder rung he had finally earned the reach for. The lead figure, old Aegis cut, arms sealed, lowered its palm. The helmet plates unscrolled in segments, folding back with a precision that made my own hands feel imprecise. The face beneath had belonged to a man once. Membrane clung along the jaw and across one cheek where resin had grown thin. The eyes were filmed like old marble. I knew the jawline because I had been forced to learn it before I was old enough to choose my own heroes. Clark, I said before I could stop myself. First engineer. I'd traced his name in the margin of the schematic on my wall until my mother had made me scrub it off. Resin had bonded his left temple to the rim of the helmet, a crescent of translucent scar. He raised his free hand like a ceremony and let a small weight fall between us. It hit the deck with a precise metallic note that made the squad tense their fingers and hold anyway. An engineer's insignia flattened by time and pressure. The Odyssey's crest worked into the center, pitted, the lines softened by a caress no human hand had given. Stand by, Landry said, too quietly for his squad, loud enough for my bones. If it moves fast, we fall to secondary and make them come the long way. The suit speaker cleared. Sound ran up through static, organized itself into something less random, more cruel. It never found a grammar. It found intent, the tone of a command remembered and retold by a machine with a voice made of 100 human throats. I heard lullabies in it and oath fragments and the end of a hymn we used to sing on Founding Day when I was a child, and still believed the anthem belonged to me. Earth chimed in our other ear with the same calm that had sent us manuals and medals. Hail, confirm class ID, hold posture, no engagement without express command. As if the word engagement hadn't already happened and found a new medium. The resonance in the station bones deepened. Dust lifted in the corners as if listening hard. Warning overlays flashed and dismissed themselves like conscientious staffers, embarrassed to be excited. "They're not coming through," Landry said after a count. "They're standing." They were, and that scared me more than a charge would have. The resin thickened around their boots, rooting them to our deck. Threads crept toward the threshold of the central hub and paused there like dogs told to heel. The figures held a formation that meant nothing to our doctrine and everything to their intention. Facing inward, eyes, if eyes, fixed on our cameras, backs to the ship as if afraid of only one thing, our refusal. A compression burst hit the tangle link, shunting other traffic offline the way a king takes a seat and ends a conversation. The voice that followed wore the shape of a man I had never met and had been made to carry. Walton Hale's cadence, stripped of mercy and stitched to a chorus. "Hail," it said, and my name lived 2 different lives in it. The line endures. The line must change. Open the gate. Bennett, newest of the squad and the only one who still kept a charm on his chest where the armor couldn't stop him, whispered, "Don't," and then remembered he didn't need to finish the sentence if he was going to be a soldier. I cut the transmission. My hand shook once and then found the console edge. "This is Senior Watch Officer Adrian Hale," I said to the feed, formal enough to count as a spell. "Perimeter holds. State your purpose." Static answered at first. Then the same voice came back, not softer, but closer, as if it had learned something about the shape of my ear. "Join us. Share the inheritance. The journey does not end. It becomes." The hub lights dimmed like a theater about to raise a curtain. Backup came on a half-beat slow, a lag we'd had documented for years because documenting lags makes them civilized. In that moment of thin light, the corridor cameras caught movement like a flock turning. More figures filing toward the hatch, their bodies remade to different degrees by the material that clothed the Odyssey. Some had uniforms, still visible under the web, ranks preserved by accident or reverence. Others were already artifacts, limbs fused to cabling, spines arched into strange obligations. "Atmos," I said. "Confirm no breach." "No breach," the kid said, too fast, then slower, deciding to earn it. "No breach. But there's something in the spectrum. Low band modulation. It's in the walls." "It's in us," Landry said under his breath, and I pretended I hadn't heard him. The cipher at my belt hummed like a trapped insect. Heat found my palm through the suit when I touched it. A new packet hit the comm. Compressed, encrypted on an old family frequency that wasn't on any station list and had never been meant to route through public systems. The panel refused it twice and then passed it when I brought the cipher close, as if the device weren't an heirloom, but a key. The screen filled with a corridor not our own, walls puckered with impressions pressing outward, faces, hands, the arch of a rib cage, each caught in the act of trying to become a surface, not violated. Vessel scars, not diagrams this time, not language, evidence. The feed stuttered, then overlaid with a shadow of Walton's face that had been built from images and voice logs and reputation. He said my name like he owned it, and then broke into the chant, the words slicing into syllables, the syllables washing into tone. The squad moved on the walls, the way trained men do when their bodies can't think anymore, and training still knows the way, checking seals by touch, sighting angles, mapping retreat in their feet. The resin at the threshold flexed like lung tissue and held. "Earthlinks degrading," the kid said. "Status pings are, sir, they're not coming back." "Assume we're alone," I said. Saying it made the air feel thinner and more honest. Landry drifted close enough that our armor almost touched. "We can't hold this corridor. We can make a line here, but it's their line. They drew it when they chose where to stand." He was right. The gate had taught us that some fights are fought at the point of first contact because there's no choice. This one had given us a choice and a lesson. The invasion wasn't at the hatch. The pressure wasn't on the bulkheads. The channel wasn't physical. The Odyssey didn't need to break us. It could convince us to open what we kept closed. "Retreat in order," I said, and heard the words Walton had never been given permission to use. "To the central hub, full containment, seal secondary access. No one breaks formation. No one gets isolated. We make them come to our door and explain themselves." Landry didn't nod. He didn't need to. He relayed the order, and the corridor became choreography. The squad withdrew by overlapping arcs, muzzles painting slow parabolas through the air, boots stepping between the glistening threads that reached like roots, and paused a breath from contact each time, as if tasting the idea of us. We crossed into the hub and pulled the heavier shutters. Manual overrides locked with a noise like a promise finally made. The hub narrowed the world to a long room of glass and console, and the hatch that now mattered more than gravity. The backup lighting found its level and stayed, a steady white that made everything look cleaner than it ever had. Outside the hatch, the figures arranged themselves in a congregation. No assault posture, no impatience, all attention. Resin thickened along the frame in slow pulses, swelling and relaxing in time with the station's environmental systems. The chant seeped through metal, no louder than machinery, no kinder than memory. I heard fleet oaths rub down to hum. I heard the end of a song my mother had stopped singing after my father didn't come home. I heard promises cut to fit a chorus. The cipher trembled where I set it on the console. When I touched it, images tried to find my hand. Not just corridors and scars, fragments of faces I had grown up with on a wall, now smoothed into generalities, the particularities sanded away by time and function. Grief made into architecture. Devotion made into interface. "Sir," Bennett said, and the word cracked. "What happens if power dies?" "We don't let it," Landry said, and there was a way to that answer that made even oxygen seem negotiable. I looked at the hatch where resin grew like caution, and at the camera where Clark's empty gaze met ours across the idea of glass. The hum in the station settled into a beat I recognized because it had learned the rhythm of my own heart and replied. "They're preparing us," I said. "Or themselves. The purpose may be the same." "What's the play?" Landry asked. He meant whether we fell back again and again until we ran out of doors, or whether we charged the myth and let it kill us in a way we could at least describe. "We hold," I said, and that was doctrine. "We learn," I added, and that was not. We stopped letting the ship draw the lines. I keyed a silent channel and flagged the fallback codes, the ones that would bleed the gate's lungs, cut the tangle, deadman the reactors. For when the last answer left in a place like this was erasure. My thumb hovered over the confirmation and didn't press because we were not there yet. Pressing early is another kind of surrender. "Understood," Landry said, watching me with the sideways attention of a man who will argue only once and only if it matters. "You sound like an officer again." The next packet arrived without encryption, sent like a dare through every speaker in the hub. Walton's cadence woven from 100 sources and no mercy. "Hail. The line endures. The line must change. Open the gate." "No," I said to the room that held my name and my inheritance and my fear. The word didn't go anywhere. It didn't have to. Sometimes the line is only that syllable repeated with enough conviction to make a shape the enemy can't imitate. Outside the hatch, the congregation swayed on their resin roots as if a tide had reached them from inside our walls. The filaments along the frame drew themselves finer, then thicker, then fine again. A beat my skull answered without permission. The cameras pixelated once, twice, as the broadcast folded itself into our systems like a hand into a glove. The world shrank to the thickness of the door and the space in my head where the next choice would live. The gate breathed. The figures waited. The chant built a bridge across silence and asked us to walk out to the middle. I set my hand on the cipher and felt it answer me. If they wanted a door, they had chosen the one I would rather die than open. That was a kind of leverage, not one I trusted, enough to count. "We're not opening," I said, more to the men than to the ship. "Not for a voice I loved, not for a story I inherited. If they want us, they come and show us what that means." Landry rolled his shoulders until the armor sat right and looked at the hatch like it had wounded someone he owed. "Then the next move is ours," he said. "It will be," I said, and let the chant keep time while I arranged the arithmetic of the risk in my head. The line we had been given had already been crossed. The line that mattered next would be one we drew ourselves. We held as long as the door would let us, the chant pushing through the metal in low tides that found the soft spaces behind the eyes. The figures outside did not advance. They watched, patient as frost, resin blooming and retreating along the hatch seam in a rhythm that matched our air systems. The Earthlink died in stages, status pings thinning to silence, until even the polite chime that meant someone far away cared enough to log us winked out. We were alone, which is to say we were back to doing the job the way it had always really been done. I set the cipher in my palm. Heat collected under the skin the way it does when your hand remembers an old burn. The station lights steadied, the hub sealed behind our shoulders, and Landry leaned into my periphery, visor up so I could see his eyes and measure how much of what I was about to say would stick. "They want us to open," I said, "not with code, with consent. And if we don't, then they wait until we get tired of being ourselves." He nodded like he'd expected the homework and found the question easier than advertised. So we change the test. We go to them. Bennett looked up from where he was checking a seal with the reverence of a parishioner touching a relic. The charm at his throat tapped once against his armor. "Sir?" "We take the cipher to their core," I said. "If it's a key, it fits two ways." The order settled into the room like gravity. Landry didn't ask whether I was right. He fitted his helmet and brought the squad to readiness ticks with a tone that made men 15 years younger remember how to breathe. We stacked at the hatch, wedged tight, our boots finding the paint line and pausing there as if the stripe could hold what our bodies might not. "On three," I said, not because ritual has magic, but because it makes muscles do the right thing when thought goes thin. We cycled the manual sequence that bypassed the ship's polite theft of our authority. Old tech, heavy and indelicate, clanked into place. The resin flexed along the frame, hair-fine filaments writhing away from our touch as if we burned. The hatch opened on a corridor I knew from diagrams and nightmares. Steel had become pale armor, shot through with veins. Surfaces buckled in outward impressions like bodies trying to finish the act of passing through. Faces pressed in relief, eyes smooth and blind, mouths open in vowels that never learned sound. Vessel scars. I had written that term in the margins of a manual at 12 years old and thought it poetry. I didn't think that now. "Eyes forward," Landry said, voice clean as a blade. "No one touches the walls." We moved. The figures that had waited at our door drew back with the stately obedience of ushers opening a path in a church. Their heads tracked us. Their bodies were wrong in a catalogue of small ways, as if each had attempted the same shape and failed differently. Resin curled from their boots to the decking, rooting them in place and leaving translucent edges like frost at dawn. Air shifted. A smell of hot antiseptic and sweetened protein slid under the filters. The corridor widened into what had once been a crew lounge and was now a shrine, if shrines could hate the living without quite knowing how. Children's toys gone gray with lacquered film. Mission patches matted into slabs, a mug with a cracked handle fused to vertebrae. The lens of a pair of spectacles caught at the top of a spine of resin so it could watch forever. At the center, a small brass sextant sat in a clear bubble. My family's story encased and displayed the way you frame an old sin and call it history. Bennett's breath fogged his visor. Landry's jaw went brace hard. I felt the want to halt pass through the squad like a shiver and die in the face of his voice. We keep moving. It's not for us. We reached the throat of the ship. The chant thickened. Words threaded through in tatters, fleet oath phrases rubbed down to vowels, nursery songs varnished in machine tone, Walton's cadence like a compass needle pulling at my skull. The core chamber received us like a cathedral, built by a species that remembered hearts and wires in the same dream. In the center, a living spire beat beneath grown glass. Light moved inside it in the color of sterile rooms. The cipher trembled against my chest, as if it had found a signal it had waited its whole life to answer. I stepped forward. Landry's gauntlet tapped once against my pauldron, one syllable of a question and a promise. I placed the cipher on the cradle the resin had formed without our consent. The device slid into fit with the clean inevitability of a story midpoint. Light climbed from within the spire, finding pathways through resin and cable and old metal. The chant sharpened to a harmony that made my bones think of knives. Everything else fell away. Armor went weightless. The squad receded to shapes. Landry's presence became pressure at my back. Memory rose around me like weather. The odyssey before the change, corridors full of bodies moving with the easy urgency of work. Laughter in a mess hall that smelled of soap and too little coffee. Then the hunger, sudden and everywhere, the first bodies swallowed into walls not as punishment, but as solution. Someone else's math written over human sums. Walton's voice ran through it all, a taut wire pulling from order to incremental sacrifice. Hold the line. The words were not a prayer, they were a ration. Another voice found Walton's and wore it like a familiar coat. Mine, then, offered like a cup of water. You're tired. You were born tired. Let the burden fall into a wider hand. Join. Become. End the fear. The core's pulses matched my pulse, beat for beat, stride for stride, until I couldn't feel which cadence belonged to which body. My hand hovered above the cipher. The promise wasn't peace. It was the end of choice. Better than grief if you squinted, a cure for loneliness if you were willing to be cured of yourself. The faces in the resin tilted as if they could hear the direction of my thought. They were not at rest, they were contained. A gunshot went off like a hand across a face. The sound cracked the room and returned my body to me. Landry had fired into the wall, not to harm, not to announce, but to call me back with the one language machines respect least and men answer best. Adrian, he said, and the channel made my name a command. Now, or we die learning what we already know. I took the cipher off the cradle. The spire screamed without air. Pain tore up through metal and resin, translated by electricity into something my nerves could understand. The construct poured Walton through me again, sweeter this time, strands of my own childhood braided in, the rough of my father's hand on my hair, the close of his coat. the silence in the house after. The offer widened. Be the link, be the unbroken story, be the end of endings. At the bottom of Walton's chord of voice, there was one note that had not been written into the construct. It was small and unbeautiful, and it was the reason the Odyssey had not brought itself back sooner. In his last moment, my grandfather had not surrendered. He had written a poison into the key and wrapped it in a blessing. I jammed the cipher back into the interface and forced the command my lineage had left hidden, a taper tucked into the molding of a frame. For the day a child wanted light more than portrait. The spire lit from the marrow out. Blue-white surged along veins, resin blistered and peeled. The chant staggered, harmonies collapsing into a sheet of noise. Outside the chamber, bodies fell like suddenly remembering gravity. The ship tried to fold the command into a ritual it could own and failed. It howled in 100 human registers, and none. "Move!" Landry's arm locked around my harness. Bennett's voice shouted something into the squad net, counting, I think, the way soldiers keep fear from owning their numbers. We ran. The corridor became a throat trying to swallow us and failing, resin surfacing and sloughing, faces smoothing back into unmarked skin as the energy tore through. At the shrine, the bubble cracked. The sextant slid free and bounced once. Landry scooped it with a grace that made me think of the man he might have been if gravity and war had had less say. He tucked it under his arm like a child. At the interface, the hatch fought us, and then conceded. The gate received us with a groan from the old braces we had been meaning to replace, and never had. Landry dragged me through, Bennett last, his rifle painting an ugly music into the corridor to keep the wrong kind of silence from taking the room. The door cycled on manual, 3, 2, 1, shutters biting down as if shocked to discover they could still be teeth. For a second, the resin held fast, pulsing as if trying to learn our rhythm in time. Then the seal cut clean. We watched through the external cameras while the Odyssey fell quiet. Light ran across its surface like rain across oil. The growth along its hull loosened, flaked, shivered into ribbons that caught the station's floods, and returned them as a color I hope I never find a name for. The clamps released with a tremor that shook our teeth. Thrusters we did not command fired in pitiful, reflexive sputters, and the old ship pushed itself away from our metal with the last courtesy of a dying guest who refuses to collapse on the host's clean floor. It drifted, wounded back into matter, shedding what it had used to become. The chant guttered to a single note, and then to nothing at all. We stood there, the station suddenly too bright and too loud in the way hospitals are after someone stops breathing. "You think that's the end?" Landry asked, voice wrecked and hopeful in equal parts. "It's the end of this," I said, and the distinction felt like safety because it was honest. We catalogued damage and loss and found ourselves stingy with either. The resin that had crept along our threshold had died the moment the core sang itself out. It clung to the seam like frost at noon and brushed away under a glove. The young tech sat down on the floor with his back to a bulkhead and laughed twice without amusement, the noise of the living accepting their continued assignment. I wrote the log entry in a hand that belonged to a man who had run out of extra words. Then I slept. For a time I do not remember. When Earth returned to us, it did so with protocol and mercy in the same tone. Debrief, commendation, therapies, the tender bureaucracy of those who believe they can make the shape of your head stop recalling the weight of a door. Years bent around the story until detail blurred at the edges. The gate was decommissioned the year after, redundancy, better arrays, smarter eyes further out where bravery can be automated. They flew me planet-side and made me tell the same event with fewer nouns until the meaning fit inside a folder. The Hale report lives somewhere you need a key to enter and a willingness to forget to leave. Landry sent a message every year on the date we didn't put in any public calendar. 2 words that never varied. Roster clean. He moved sideways into training, which meant he learned to put names on fear and hand it to boys like something that could be folded and placed in a pocket. I imagine he keeps a box of scrap on his desk, small salvations that weigh the same as guilt, and touches them before he tells a room they will be fine. Bennett never came back past the belt. He grows tomatoes under a Martian dome and teaches kids the trick for making their own gravity by making their own work. When he is tired, he tells them a story about a door and a song that didn't win and doesn't have to say any names. The sextant vanished into a vault for a while, a museum of dangerous certainties. It came home to me eventually, scuffed and dignified, and I put it on my windowsill where it catches morning light and makes it older. Some nights I wake with the taste of antiseptic in my mouth and the surety that resin is creeping along the floor. Those nights I turn on the kitchen light and make coffee I do not drink. I hold the cipher and feel nothing but its cool weight and the absence where a chorus could be. The world went on being noisy and unafraid in all the ways worth defending. Young voices argued about expansion and safety, like those ideas had just met. They spoke about lines as if lines were laws of physics instead of choices made at doors. I wanted to tell them that a line is something you draw with your body and redraw when it breaks you and redraw again because breaking is not the same as ending. I did not tell them. My duty was done. On the last page of my personal log, I wrote a sentence that felt more like a promise than a record. The line held, but it was never the line that saved us. It was the choosing. I closed the file and let the system archive it in whatever drawer it uses for inconvenient truths. Sometimes the city's lights flicker in a rhythm that pulls me to the window. I stand there with my hand on the sill and listen to the hush that hides under every human sound. If I tilt my head just so, the old Fleet anthem tries to play in the static of a damaged speaker somewhere down the block. Half melody, half memory, mostly air. I do not reach for the calm. I do not ask the silence what it means. I let the quiet be what it is, and I go back to bed. Out beyond the maps, the dark is still patient. It pulls the way it always has. But the myth has been trimmed down to something livable. The gate is gone, the wall dismantled and reincarnated further out where other watch officers breathe duty like oxygen and learn when to say no. If they ever ask for advice, and they won't, I would tell them this. Lines are not monuments. They are pencil marks. Draw them where you must, erase them when you have to, have the nerve to do both and come home. When I sleep, I dream of a corridor where faces have no mouths and no need of them. They watch me pass and do not accuse. In the dream, I carry nothing. The sextant stays on the sill. The cipher stays in the drawer. My hands are empty, and still I am enough to say what matters. The book of this watch closes here. The choice is made, and it will need to be made again by someone whose name I do not know. That is not a burden. It is the privilege of breath. And outside, past the static line, the silence keeps its counsel, which is what we paid for and what we needed, and for now, all I want.